best-selling author, a board-certified psychiatrist, perinatal psychiatrist too, right? Keynote speaker and a contributor to the New York Times. Dr. Lakshmin's numerous New York Times essays included the viral "How Society Has Turned Its Backs on Mothers" and "Saying No is Self-Care for Parents" have been read and shared by millions. As a women's mental health thought leader, she has been featured by top media outlets like Good Morning America, The Today Show, NPR, The New York Times, The Guardian, and many more. So she's here to kind of share the message from her debut book, Real Self-Care, Crystals, Cleanses, and Bubble Baths Not Included. This was named the NPR's Best Book of 2023, and it was a national bestseller. So I'm just so happy, you guys don't even know, I'm obsessed with the fact that she is here. I know you all are really going to enjoy this, so get your tissues ready, get your notebooks out, be ready to take some notes, and take this knowledge home with you. So everyone, please help me in giving a warm welcome to Dr. Pooja Lakshmin.
There we go. Okay. Well, thank you, Amy, for that amazing introduction, and Stephanie and the whole crew that has brought me here. This is actually my first time in Montana ever in my life, and it's gorgeous. It's gorgeous here. So I don't have slides. I just like to talk, and I'm going to talk for about 40 or 50 minutes. And then there'll be lots of time for questions, too. I was saying earlier, before I got on stage, that this room definitely feels like home to me because I'm a perinatal psychiatrist by training. I still practice 2 days a week, and I take care of all women, mostly mothers that are pregnant, postpartum. I prescribe medication, but I also do psychotherapy, and I have been in so many rooms like this where it is the largely women, although I do see some men, some brave men. There's one. I think there was somebody else over there. Anyway, yeah. That the type of person that goes into this work usually has their own personal experience or a family experience. So it is, it's hard work. We're all here because we have been impacted, and so I want to say thank you to everything that all of you in this room are doing, and I hope that by the end of my time talking, you will get a better understanding of why it is so important to do your own real self-care. So the way that I'm going to structure this is I'm going to tell you a little bit about my personal story, and then I'm going to share some specific tips and tools that you can use to put real self-care, the principles of real self-care, in practice in your own life. But first, I want to ask the room, how many of you feel like the main indicator or metric for your role right now is how many women and families you serve and taking care of them? Yeah, or what is your main purpose in your job? I guess. How many of you feel like that is taking care of others, that the main purpose in your job is taking care of others? All right, yeah, pretty much everybody. What if I told you, well, let me ask this. How many of you feel like the main purpose of your job is to take care of yourself? Thank you. Yes. Well, my work here is done. No, none of us do. Right. Well, so exactly. So what I want you to get at the end of this conversation is that the two are intimately intertwined. Your ability to really take care of yourself, not the juice cleanses and the bubble baths, but real self-care, is intimately intertwined with how you show up for the families that you work with, your capacity to support them and hold them, and And the other thing that I like to say too is that, and I'll keep coming back to this, success is staying in the game. So we as perinatal mental health providers are working in a stigmatized role. Regardless of the patient population that you work with or the clients that you work with, this field of women's mental health is one that is always swimming upstream, right? We are always underfunded. We are always under-resourced. And so the rates of burnout in our profession are super high. And therefore, I always say to my patients and people that I'm teaching and working with is success is staying in the game. It's staying in the game. It's not how many people you served. It's not your patient load. It's not your client load. It's not whether, you showed up for that last delivery. I think there was like a labor and delivery nurse that, the Village? Yes. Sorry. Right. But it's not each of those things. It's actually your capacity to stay in this field for your career and to not just burn out and peace out. So please keep that in mind. And I'm going to share now a little bit of my own personal story as a what not to do, basically. So and the reason that I share my personal story is because I want you all to understand that I'm bringing this message to you not from like the ivory tower as a psychiatrist, et cetera, but I'm really bringing it to you as a woman who has been there and has wanted to jump in the car and run away, who has wanted to just be like, peace out, I'm moving to a vegetable farm. Like literally I had fantasies of like just going and living on a farm. And I don't like dirt or getting my hands dirty. Somehow I thought, I could just live on a farm and be happy. I say that as I'm in Montana. But right, so I've been there, and this is very much my personal experience. So I'm now 40, and almost 15 years ago, 15? Yeah, maybe a little more. When I was in my late 20s, I found myself sort of having reached the top of the ladder, like done all the things that I had been supposed to do as a good Indian girl, Indian daughter. My parents are immigrants from South Asia, from India. And I had, up until that point, kind of done everything that they wanted me to do. I had gotten the best grades, gone to an Ivy League college, become a doctor, gotten married, just basically checked off every item on the list. And in my mid-20s, after having reached that pinnacle of success, I was at a prestigious residency program on the West Coast. I was sort of like, okay, well, like now I can figure out how to be happy. Like now I can learn that skill. And I remember I was on my honeymoon actually at the time, and I was reading that book, The Happiness Project by Gretchen Rubin, which is a great book, and I like Gretchen Rubin's work a lot. But not the best sign when you're reading that book on your honeymoon, in retrospect. And it was like I had everything that I was supposed to have, but it wasn't according to my values. It was according to society's values and my parents' values, which, as a side note, I always like to say, like, it's not that those were bad values or wrong values. Like, every parent wants their kid to be well-educated, to be in a career that is financially stable, to, get married and start a family. Like, those are normal things that parents want, and especially coming from an immigrant family where, I had seen my parents sacrifice everything for me and my sister, and I had a grandfather who actually left India. He was an academic. He left because our family is not Brahmin, which is like the highest caste in the caste system in India, so he wasn't getting the opportunities that he deserved. And so I had all this kind of like history on top of me, and I felt like I was supposed to be the one to really bring it forward. I was the first woman in my family on the maternal side to work outside the home, let alone go to medical school. So it was like all of these pressures were on me to kind of do the quote unquote right thing. But once I reached the end, I wasn't happy. And on top of that, I was in my training to become a psychiatrist. And I had all these questions about psychiatry. Like I just felt, and I didn't feel like I was getting the right answers. So just things that, and these are things that you all deal with all the time, like the patient that comes into the ER and they are suicidal and depressed and unhoused, and we're prescribing Zoloft, and it's like, Zoloft's not going to do anything for this person. Like they need housing, but feeling so powerless of how to fix that or how to solve that, and at that time, in my 20s, being naive and thinking because I went to medical school, because I was a doctor, I was somehow supposed to be able to solve all these problems, when in fact now I understand that there's so many problems that my patients have that I can't solve. Or in relation to women's mental health, things like, why is the patient who comes in suicidal and has bipolar disorder, why does their insurance cover their hospital stay? Whereas when somebody who comes in and has borderline personality disorder and is suicidal, their insurance, say, is not covered. And I would ask these questions, and there's basically no good answer that anybody could give me besides our insurance system is broken. Or working in Northern California, where I had patients, women who had multiple graduate degrees, were very, very well accomplished, and were at home bored out of their minds because their husbands were wealthy VCs who brought in tons of money, and so they didn't need to quote unquote work, and then were coming in diagnosed with bipolar disorder. But I was like, is it bipolar disorder, or is it just that they need more of a purpose and actually want to be doing things in their life that feel fulfilling and energizing? So anyway, all this is a long, long way of saying that I blew up my life. I blew up my marriage, I dropped out of my residency program, and I moved into a commune in San Francisco, a wellness commune that was focused on spirituality, alternative medicine, meditation, female sexuality, female orgasm. My parents were shocked and horrified. So were all of my friends, really. I mean, they were like, well, what happened to Pooja? This was Pooja, who was Phi Beta Kappa at Penn, and was just always so driven to get to the next thing and do the thing. And it took me a year of being in that commune to kind of fully, and it was a cult, I found out later, because they always are, but just to put that out there. But it took me a year of being in that space to someone mentioned to me at the time, oh, you were just so burnt out. And I was like, what? I'm not burnt out, no. And then I was like, oh, maybe I was burnt out. And so it was I had to go to such extreme lengths to search for some answer that I was not able to find in Western medicine or allopathic medicine. But after being with that group for 2 years, what I did learn, not shocking, is that the wellness world, the woo-woo world, has just as many contradictions and hypocrisies as mainstream medicine, and that you can't just run away from your life. I mean, you can, but your problems will still follow you. And so after that happened, I ultimately, I turned 30 in my childhood bedroom. My family's from Reading, Pennsylvania. And I still remember, my mom still had my Samantha American Girl doll, on my desk. And so it was I'm turning 30 in this little twin bed, and there's a Samantha Girl doll. And I was like, oh, God, I've ruined my life. I ruined my life. And I do like to also bring up that ruining your life is a luxury. The reason that I was able to throw everything away was because, one, I didn't have student loans. And two, I did have a family that, supported me afterwards. I was able to crash at their house for 6 months. And that's a huge privilege. huge privilege. Like the fact that my parents sacrificed all this as immigrants allowed me to then have the luxury of being a 20-something with an existential crisis. So I think like we need to be better. And when I say we, I mean those of us who, are teaching and speaking and trying to motivate, is to acknowledge our privilege when we have it. So anyway, so I turned 30 and ultimately I decided to come back to medicine. And that was the hardest decision I've ever made, to kind of come back and say, whoa, I like went all the way down the rabbit hole and here I am now trying to start over essentially. But I made a promise to myself that this time I was going to do it differently. And I was going to trust myself. And I was going to do medicine in the way that I wanted to do it. I was going to be a psychiatrist in the way that I liked to practice and what I felt worked for me, as opposed to having medicine run my life. I was going to allow myself to live and build a life and have medicine be a part of it. So I'll tell you a little bit at the end of how that's kind of worked out over the past decade or so. But essentially, when I finished my training, then in 2016, I started practicing women's mental health and perinatal psychiatry. And much to my shock and horror at that time, this was 2016, 2017, I started having patients come in and tell me essentially like, Dr. Lakshmin, I'm stressed out, I'm burnt out, I'm not eating well, I'm not sleeping well, and I feel like it's my fault because I have the meditation app on my phone that I know I'm supposed to be using, but by the time I get home at the end of the day, the only thing that I can be trusted to do is literally like just doom scroll or sit on the couch and zone out to Real Housewives. And I found myself kind of like a broken record to my patients saying like, no, this isn't your fault. This is systemic. This is structural. This isn't about willpower and you beating yourself up and shaming yourself into learning how to meditate. We live in a country where we still don't have paid federally mandated parental leave. Almost 30 million Americans don't have health insurance. I think it's something like 20% of Native or Indigenous people don't have health insurance. If you're a black woman working in America, you have to work for 19 months to make the same amount of money that a white man will make in 12 months. And that number actually is 21 for Native and Indigenous women. A quarter of American workers can't take a paid sick day, right? Like this isn't about going to yoga and it fixing everything. These are all systemic, structural issues. And the reality is, like, if we're telling it as it is, like this economy that we live in essentially is built on the guilt of women and caregivers who will keep going and keep giving despite being at the end of their ropes in order to keep the system going. But we'll get to guilt in a second. So anyway, so I was hearing this from all my patients, and at the same time, I had remembered my commitment to myself of not losing myself in medicine anymore, and I was looking for a creative outlet, so I started an Instagram account, as any geriatric millennial would do. And through that, it led to writing for the New York Times, which led to writing for the book, Real Self-Care. But it really hit me that we have put the burden of wellness and resilience on the individual, as opposed to understanding that the reason so many of us feel like we want to run away to the vegetable farm is because we don't have the systemic support. We don't have that village or that family. We're trying to create it in our third spaces, and it's so hard because it's so hard to get funding for these types of things because we have a system that valorizes individuality and independence as opposed to interconnectivity. So, okay, what do you guys do with all of this, right? Like, you're not gonna run away to a cult, I hope. That's not the answer. So what I want you to take away is that real self-care is not the juice cleanse, it's not the bubble bath. It's actually internal. It's principles. internal principles that you can make your own. You can't buy it at Target, but it's boundaries, compassion, values, power. Those are the 4 principles that I lay out in Real Self-Care. And I'm the first to admit, like, I didn't invent this. Like, these are not my principles. These are tried and true, tested psychological tools and skills that essentially, if you were to kind of take one of Cliff's notes of how to have improved mental health, those are the 4 things. Boundaries, compassion, values, power. Another word for power is agency, and we'll talk about that. So we're going to run through these principles because I want you all to feel like you are, have something tangible that you can take away of how to put this in play in your life. Boundaries is number 1 because in order to even start to consider how to, quote unquote, take care of yourself, you need to actually make space for yourself. Like energetically, psychologically, like you have to understand that you are a separate individual from the other people around you that you take care of. So if you are, if you're somebody who's on Instagram or TikTok, you probably noticed that like every single therapist talks about boundaries. At this point, it could be a little bit eye roll, but my take on boundaries is different. So I think of boundaries as not always saying no, but boundaries are the pause. So I had this aha moment when I had first graduated from GW, and I just gotten my offer to be on the faculty. It was like my dream job in the women's mental health clinic. And my mentor, she took me out for lunch on the first day, and she was like, Pooja, I want to give you a piece of advice. And I was like, oh my gosh, like, I thought it was going to be like some special secret about how to dose SSRIs or like how to switch mood stabilizers. But she was like, no, you don't have to answer your phone. You can listen to what they want, decide, and then respond. And that was like a really big aha for me at that moment because I had just gone through med school and residency where at that time we had pagers or beepers where they would go off and you'd have like that PTSD, like that response, exactly, where you just had to call back immediately, right? It was a very traumatizing. So I was like, oh, okay. So the boundary is the pause. And then for me at that time when I was still in full-time academics, it was like, oh, okay, sometimes maybe it's the front desk calling. And they have a bunch of insurance paperwork, and I can call the back and say, I'll come around at the end of the day. But maybe it's a patient who I know her ADHD is so bad that if she misses her Adderall or her stimulant just one day, she could get into a car accident. Okay, I'm going to put that refill in right away. But I get to decide, and the pause is the boundary. And then you always have 3 options: yes, no, or negotiate. Yes, no, or negotiate. Because the truth is that no, it does always have a cost. Like, you can't always say no. In fact, a lot of the time you can't say no. And depending on how much privilege and support you have in your life, no will be more accessible to you. So for example, let's say you work a corporate job and your boss asks you to, join another project, even though you're completely swamped, but you know that they're doing layoffs. If you say no, you literally could lose your job. But if you're the primary breadwinner and your whole family gets health insurance through your job, that's a huge risk. Or let's say it's something in your personal life. Like if you were to call your mother-in-law and say, hey, sorry, like this year we're not gonna make it for Thanksgiving. Like there's gonna be hell to pay. There's gonna be drama. So the cost could be financial, the cost could be emotional, interpersonal, but it's always there. So you can't just bury your head in the sand and pretend that people can just always say no. So what do you do if you're in that circumstance at work or at home where you take the pause and then you do the calculus and you're like, yeah, I actually wish I could say no, but I can't right now. I have to say yes. Then you make a mental note for yourself and you say, okay, 6 months from now, 1 year from now, what do I need to do or put in place so that no is more accessible? And that is something that question, that strategizing, you can take that to your coach or to your therapist or even to your book club or, that's something that is actionable and tangible that you can actually think through and work on. That's something that takes time to build towards. The other thing about boundaries is, and what I'm getting at here, is that setting a boundary it's not supposed to be a brick wall. And if it is a brick wall, that actually means that you've gone wrong somewhere. So like in my example, where, I fell off the planet and moved into the commune, the reason that I had to do something so extreme was because I hadn't set any boundaries and I didn't know how. And so I had to just kind of break it off, but that was so traumatic. That was really traumatic for me, that was really traumatic for my family. So the goal is you want to avoid that. You don't want it to get to a place where you feel like you have to erect this wall. So I like to think of boundaries as, instead of a wall, it's more like, it's like a net around a trampoline. You know those big trampolines people have in their backyards where the kids are all like trying to kill each other on there? That's actually what a boundary should be. Like, information can pass back and forth, it's flexible, but it's still there. It's a space in between. So that's boundaries, and that's step one. And I will be honest, it's probably the hardest one, because once you start setting boundaries, people are going to be pissed at you. Yeah, and that's always the number one question people have. They're like, okay, Pooja, sure, but like everyone's mad at me. And I'm like, yeah, they're going to be. If you're doing it right, people in your life are going to be upset, especially if you haven't had good boundaries, because they are used to you always being the one to pick up that shift that nobody wants to do, or to run in and stay extra, or to, sign up for that committee, or be the room mom, or whatever it is. They know that you don't have good boundaries, so they're going to come to you. And then you've gotten sort of mixed up and tangling up your self-worth with your ability to become a martyr. So that is why the next principle is compassion, because ultimately what you're going to feel when you start setting boundaries is guilt. You're going to feel guilty. And so so the thing with guilt is that it's like a sham. I call it a sham emotion because, as I said earlier, like our entire economy and maybe even healthcare system is built on the guilt of healthcare workers and women. So I was running a postpartum group a couple years ago when I was still living in DC, and it was like a group at a birthing studio, and they had a little postpartum support stress group. And there was a woman who came to this group, but she wasn't a patient of mine. She just kind of was like a walk-in to the group. And she had a new baby, and she was still on maternity leave. And at the end of the group, she came up to me and she was like, Pooja, I have a question. I'm on maternity leave. This is my first baby. I just got an email last week from the HR person saying that they messed up my paperwork, and I actually have 2 extra weeks of FMLA through DC that's paid for, that nobody remembered. And they said I can take it. And then she was like, but I feel so bad because my team was expecting me to be back, and this is a busy time of year, and like, how could I spring that on them last minute? And then like literally in the same breath, she was like, but then I feel so bad if I don't take it because this is such precious time with my baby. And I was like, wait, like, are you hearing yourself? Like, you have made it so that no matter what option you take, no matter what choice you make, you made a mistake. You're the bad guy. You did something wrong. You're letting people down. That's impossible. Like, it can't be that way. That's not reality-based. That means that it's not actually you, and it's coming from the outside. It's coming from all of these systems that we talked about, the injustices that we talked about, the fact that we don't have paid parental leave, the fact that how hard it is to find a therapist, all these other things, how expensive childcare is. So Martha Beck, who is a health coach and a sociologist, who was Oprah's life coach, she talks about how anthropologically it's like women are stuck in these systems where if you follow the rules, if you follow A, B, and C and do that right, then somebody comes up to you and says, well, what about X, Y, and Z. You didn't do that. You're supposed to be able to do all the things, even though they're contradictory, directly contradictory. So when you start to hear that guilt monster coming up, I want you to think about that woman in the postpartum group and remind yourself that this isn't you. Like, that guilt is not actually based in reality. It is something that is coming from the outside. The other tool that I like to use when I'm helping my patients work with guilt, it comes from acceptance and commitment therapy. Any ACT folks here? Awesome. Yeah, I love ACT. Yeah. So ACT is a third wave type of psychotherapy. So brief history lesson. The first wave of psychotherapy was Freud, and he said that everything is your parents' fault, which is not totally untrue, but he had some other stuff that was, a little bit more problematic. And then the second wave was CBT, cognitive behavioral therapy. And CBT says that you can change your thoughts and feelings, and therefore change your behaviors. If you change your thoughts and feelings, your behaviors will change. The third wave of therapy are things like acceptance and commitment therapy, ACT, and DBT, dialectical behavior therapy. And those two schools of therapy pull from mindfulness and Eastern practices, meditation, and they acknowledge that, life is suffering. Life includes suffering. We can't be happy all the time, and we shouldn't be happy all the time. And the goal is not to avoid hard feelings, because when you spend your whole life avoiding hard feelings, then you end up in a situation like I did, where you jump ship, and we don't want that, right? So you need to learn how to deal with hard feelings. So one of the ACT metaphors, ACT is really great for metaphors, which is you kind of, when those hard feelings come up, you start to think about something else. So I'll guide you through it. It's called the sushi train metaphor. It comes from Russ Harris, who is a teacher of ACT. So imagine that you are at one of those sushi restaurants where the plates of sushi are coming around on the conveyor belt. Do you guys know what I'm talking about? Yeah. And the chef in the middle, he's making the plates, cutting the fish and the rice. That's your mind. That's your brain. Your brain is the chef. And each plate of sushi that comes through the conveyor belt, that is a thought, a feeling, an idea, a memory, whatever is rolling through your head that day, at that moment. And now there's going to be some plates of sushi that look really good. Like for me, I really like spicy tuna roll. But there's going to be other, and you're going to want to pick them up and gobble them up, right? Things that look appetizing. But then there's going to be other plates that look really gross. Like for me, I really don't like when the shrimp have their head on. I find that to be, with the eyes, gross. So when you see those things, you want to push them away, right? And those are like the hard thoughts, the guilt, that feeling that comes when you take the pause and you set a boundary. Oh my God, I'm being selfish. Oh my God, everyone hates me. Oh my God, they're going to be so mad at me. But the reality is that when you're sitting at a sushi restaurant and you sit down with your friends, you don't just start like grabbing plates or pushing plates away. You let everything roll by. You're curious. You ask the chef, oh, like, where did you come up with that recipe? What sauce is that? Like, what fish is this, right? And so with guilt, with any hard thought, think about the sushi train and ask yourself, can I be curious about this thought or feeling? Can I allow this thought or feeling to be one out of millions that are running through your mind? It doesn't need to be, just because you feel it or think it doesn't mean it's the truth. And in fact, when you allow guilt to be the truth, then you just end up so far away from yourself that you are at much higher risk for burning out. Because again, remember we talked about success is staying in the game. Success is staying in the game. Success is not answering every call as soon as it comes in. Success is not saying yes to every single request. It is staying in the game. So the guilt does not need to be your moral compass. It can just be a feeling that's there. And imagine that there's just like a volume dial, and you can turn the volume down a little bit. It's there, but it doesn't give you any valuable information. It doesn't need to control you. The reason that I harp on this so much is because I think that a lot of times we believe that we need to like stop feeling guilty or get rid of the guilt. But the reality is, again, because how we've talked about how these problems, these are structural, these are systemic, you're not going to get rid of the guilt. The guilt is baked into capitalism, baked into institutional racism, baked into patriarchy. It's part of the whole thing. So it will be there. You just don't need to listen to it all the time. So sometimes people say to me, they're like, okay, great, Pooja, yes. And like, but I have like 5 kids and I work a full-time job and like everybody depends on me and I'm the one that needs to do everything. And I say, okay, I'm not asking you to put yourself at the front and center of your world, although that would be nice. I'm just asking you to allow yourself to be one small part. So, even something as simple as like, what are we gonna have for dinner? I have so many patients, and I have a 2-year-old at home. I'm guilty of this as well, where you're just like, let's just give in to what they want. Let's just give in. But what I would love for people to do is to say, okay, well, what about maybe every one time out of 5 where we actually listen to your preference? It doesn't have to be every time, but let's allow it to be at least one of the options. Because when it's not even on the table, when your preference, when your wants, when your desires are not even on the table at all, then you end up feeling like you're managing your family as opposed to actually being part of your family. And yes, this is more work, and it sucks that we women have to be the ones to do this. It sucks. And that's the nature of a power structure. That's the nature of a system that has been built upon oppressed people. In that the people that are in power, the people who benefit from these systems, they're not all of a sudden one day going to wake up and be like, yeah, hey guys, sure, take it all, like it's fine. No, they're going to kick and scream, as we are seeing currently, So you have to get comfortable with being the one to do that extra work in your life. And you also have to get comfortable with the fact that nobody's going to give you permission to do it. Nobody is going to give you permission. You just have to take it. You have to claim it, and that's the only way. So we've talked about boundaries. We've talked about compassion. The next principle of real self-care is values, our values. And 2 things with values. So the first is that a value is different than a goal. So a goal, this comes from ACT as well. A goal is a static thing to achieve. It's a noun. A goal is I want to run a marathon. A goal is I want to drive across country from Helena to New York City, right? That's a goal. A value is what do you want to embody while you're achieving that goal? A value is an adjective or an adverb. It's something that you can always keep with you and display or feel, but it's not something that you check off a list. So let's say with that drive, how do you want to show up on that long drive? Do you want to have it be fun? Do you want to listen to a certain type of music? Do you want to bring a friend with you because you want to really value connection? Do you want to visit every barbecue joint on the way there because you love food and eating new foods connects you with your value of diversity or adventure, right? So it's all about like the how of how you do it. So when I ask my patients or people that I meet about like, well, what are your values? People usually get kind of mad at me because they're just like, well, Pooja, I don't have time to think about that. I have to decide what's for dinner tonight, Who has time to think about values? But the reality is, once you start setting boundaries and once you let yourself deal with that guilt and start to make space, then you have to decide like, okay, well, what's working in my life? What's not working? What do I want to do next? What's happening? And that's where the values come into play. Because everybody has a different blueprint for values, and we can't just pick a cookie cutter life or a cookie cutter career or a cookie cutter relationship. And, I learned that the hard way. So to kind of finish my story here or my journey so far is after I turned 30, I came back to medicine. I transferred to George Washington University, which was a better fit for me than where I was previously, because there was a global mental health program, so I got to do projects in Bangalore, India, where my family's from, and there was this women's mental health clinic that I got to train in. And it's actually called 5 trimesters, because we count the first trimester as conception, for when you're trying to get pregnant, which is its own journey for a lot of people, myself included. So I got to do all that. It was the right place for me. They offered me this faculty position when I graduated, and I was like bright-eyed and bushy-tailed. And I did it for 3 years. But I realized when I was on full-time faculty, and this isn't specific to GW, this is everywhere, but I realized like I had no interest actually in writing academic papers or doing research in that way. I found that turns out I'm not a very good researcher. And I found writing academic papers to be really boring. I liked to write on Instagram. I liked to write for the New York Times. I liked to do writing that was aligned with my values, one of my values being self-expression and creativity. And being in that academic writing world was not the right one for me. I also realized I didn't want to manage people. So therefore, I did not want to be a chair of a department or a program director of any of these things, because I didn't like managing people. So because I had come in this time holding on to myself and having boundaries, even though all my mentors and advisors and supervisors wanted me to stay, they're like, oh, you be the program director, you do this, you do that, let's get this grant. I was like, no, I'm going to start a private practice. I'm going to teach in the women's mental health clinic because I really like doing that. I like getting to talk to the residents. But I'm going to pursue writing. And I was able to do that because I understood that, again, I had to be the one to choose. Like all of my mentors, all these other people in my life, they had good intentions. It's not that any of their direction or ideas were wrong. It was just that that was what they wanted me to do. That was their idea of a good life. After I started writing and had like a little bit of a success, like I had a couple pieces in the New York Times that did really well, I had an opportunity to talk to Samantha Meltzer-Brody. Does anybody know Samantha Meltzer-Brody? She's the chair at UNC. She's probably like one of the foremost perinatal psychiatrists in the country, and has done like tons and tons of groundbreaking research on PMADs. So she was kind of like the pinnacle of, the path that I did not go on. And I was on a phone call with her, interviewing her for a story, and she gave me the sweetest gift. She said, Pooja, you have done so much for women's mental health. Thank you so much for your work. And it just hit me because I was like, oh, yeah. Like we all have our own journeys. We all have our own paths to the same goal, to uplift and energize women. But the way that you do it should be and can be aligned with what you enjoy doing and what your strengths are. And in that moment when she said that to me, it kind of like all clicked in my mind. I was like, oh yeah, I don't need to try to be somebody that I'm not. I can go with who I am and craft my life and my career to that end. Now that doesn't mean that everything is like, birds chirping, Pollyanna. Like there's definitely still, again, we all have to do things that are hard. And for me, part of what I went through in the early part of my life now is, a decade of therapy, and coming to understand that I did want to be a mom myself, despite some of my early experiences with South Asian patriarchal culture. And I went through IVF to have my son later in life, which again, privileged to be able to have health insurance that helped to pay for that, thanks to my partner who works a corporate job. So he has good health insurance. So then I am able to also pursue a independent career where I own my own business. So I don't have that security, right? So there's always these pros and cons. But it works when it's what you really want. And when you've made the decisions and you understand why. That's a very different type of decision making than the decision making that comes from guilt. The decision making that comes from guilt is fear-based or shame-based. You're worried about what other people are going to think of you. You're worried that you're selfish. You're worried that you're a bad person. Whereas the decision-making that comes from setting boundaries, speaking to yourself with compassion, understanding like what you really care about, what really energizes you, that type of decision-making it's forward-looking. It allows you to move with more freedom. That doesn't mean that there's not going to be costs to pay and, things that happen and sacrifices to make, sure. But if you understand your values and your reasons behind that decision making, then it's going to you will feel at peace with the sacrifices when you understand the deeper reasoning underneath. So, let me think here. I've actually been thinking a lot about rest. It's funny, when I wrote Real Self-Care, I didn't have rest there was no rest section in any part of the book. And a friend, an early reader, read it, and she was like, Pooja, maybe you should put something about rest in here. I was like, oh. It tells you a little bit about I write what I need to know, which I think a lot of authors and therapists do, because this is work. This is the other thing with Real Self-Care, is that it's not a checklist. It's not one and done. Every single transition, every single change you go through in your life, you will have to pick up and get back on the wagon. You will forget boundaries. You will beat yourself up. You will listen to your inner critic, and then you'll have to say to yourself, oh, wait, I need to come back. I need to come back. And that's normal. And so this ties into rest, because last year when the book came out, it did really well. And I was saying yes to every single media interview and podcast and speaking event. And like I mentioned, I have a 2-year-old at home. I drove myself to the ground. Last fall, I ended up in the hospital for 4 nights, longer than I stayed in the hospital when I had my C-section. Because it turned out that I had gallstones, and I had to get my gallbladder out, and then I had a kidney stone. I'm telling you all this because for me, it was sort of like, oh my gosh, I just wrote this book called Real Self-Care, and now I'm in the hospital. Literally, when I got admitted to the hospital, the first thing I said to Justin, my partner, I was like, I feel like I'm on vacation, because there was a nurse checking on me and bringing me food, and I was like, this is bad. This is not good for somebody who is supposed to be telling people how to beat burnout. And then I said, oh, but you know what? It's because I have a completely different job now. Basically overnight, my career changed. Previously, I was just seeing patients. I was seeing patients. I was doing a little bit of writing, but now I'm speaking. I'm learning to teach in a way that is very different than when you're one-to-one with a patient and you know their whole story and you understand all of the little, their motivations and their fears and et cetera. Whereas in a situation like this, it's a different skill set. I was basically thrown into a different career, and that's a transition. And every time you go through a transition, whether it's something in your career, whether it is in your personal life, a new relationship, a relationship that ends, having a baby, having your kids go off to college, having your own parents get old and have to take care of them, right? All of these things are shifts and transitions, and each time you'll find yourself falling into the old patterns of giving too much, of people pleasing, of putting yourself last. But the good news is, for me at least, what I've learned, and with my patients, is that each time you learn it, you spot it more quickly. So I knew pretty quickly, obviously I was in the hospital, but yeah, I was like, yeah, this is a problem. I need to change things around here. And I see that in my practice too, where it's these are muscles that you learn, you develop, and then you can feel it and you can apply those skills in a new context. So, back to your actual question about rest, which I've, again, managed to avoid talking about. I think I don't use the word rest a lot with my patients because I think it's a vague word. I love the nap ministry and the work that she's doing because Tricia Hershey, and her book is Rest is Resistance, because it is resistance. Rest is resistance in a capitalist culture that prioritizes and exalts productivity and activity. So rest is resistance. It's subverting the values of our culture. And most of my patients don't know how to rest, like you said. So I emphasize first just sleep. I emphasize sleep, not rest. Like and when I say sleep, I don't mean, like I say, like you need to either go into the basement where it's dark, like you need to get away from the baby, or you need to go to, a friend's house. Like I had a patient last year when she had her baby. Her friend allowed her that lived in the neighborhood, had an extra bedroom. So literally like 3 times a week, she would go to her friend's house and take a nap for 2 hours in her friend's guest bedroom. So she was away from the baby, away from the house, away from the mess, right? And not tempted to like do the dishes or wash bottles or whatever. But that's sleep. But I consider that to be very different than rest, which I think has to actually be intentional and more curated. And because the thing is, like, sometimes, rest could be just like sitting on the couch watching Netflix. Like maybe that is really what you need, but then other times that could be something that is actually quite depleting. So you have to be able to sort of understand what you need and have the self-awareness to understand. So I'm trying to think here. Other things that I guess would consider rest or think about are things like gardening, making puzzles, anything that's like repetitive and somewhat physical that's using a different part of your brain, where you're not trying to figure something out, but you're very fully occupied in that activity. So sort of like a flow state. If you're somebody who likes art or to sing or play music, that can be a form of rest. So I guess I think of rest as anything that kind of brings more in to you. It's actually funny that you asked this question, Amy, because I'm working on my next book right now, and it's actually it's not about rest, but it's about transitions, which the rest piece is part of that. So the last thing I want to say on this is kind of related to this topic, but asking for help. Asking for help is a big part of the postpartum period, and just in general, self-compassion and getting out of this like martyr situation that so many healthcare providers find themselves in. And so I think a lot of you probably will identify with this example based on your work with clients, but I had a patient who I was doing therapy with, who we were just chatting about something unrelated, and she mentioned that her partner was going to be going away for one night for work, and she would be home with her 2 little kids. And she was like, oh, like my sister offered to come over to help with bedtime and bath and everything, but I said it's fine. And I was like, oh, but what do you mean? Like, you'll be alone. Wouldn't it be good to have an extra set of hands? No, it's just one night. It's fine. And we had this conversation because I was like, but your sister offered and you're rejecting it. And that was her bid for connection with you. If anyone knows the work of the Gottmans, the couples therapists folks who talk about like bids for connection in relationship, I think there's a similar thing, except it's bid for connection in our communities. And this was her sister saying, like, I want to be part of your community, and I want you to be part of mine. But if you keep saying no, then you're constantly rejecting her, and that is actually you saying, I don't want you to be part of my support system. And so I think it's really important, actually, in the same way that we need to work on the pause for boundaries, I think we also need to work on learning how to say yes to help. And the only way to do that then, when it does feel so hard, because especially, I would imagine many of us in the room, we are in a life season where, our friends also have all of their own responsibilities and their kids and their parents and their jobs, and we always kind of feel like, oh, but, everyone's so busy. So to actually ask for help and say yes when you need it is almost an advanced skill. The place to start is when somebody offers help and you don't need it. And you say yes. Somebody offers to hold the door for you. Say yes. The other week I was talking to somebody who was like, after I gave a talk and they were like, I was in Vermont. And she came up to me and she was like, yeah, like I just realized like last week I was like holding like 5 boxes and like trying to walk through a door and like some guy was like, oh, let me help you with that. And I was like, no, it's fine. She was like literally holding this big thing. It's like just even those small things where, again, this is the American way, right? We pull ourselves up by our bootstraps, but there's so much we can learn from other cultures that operate in a more communal way where you do depend on the people around you, and that's how you actually build community. Again, that was not about rest, but I think somewhat related. More questions or thoughts? Yeah. Please, I love questions.
Which has a lot to do with my question. So a lot of people in this room, we are advocates in what I found out last night from the Siloed movie is very much a desert for medical access. So how do you deal with the guilt portion if you are truly one of the only people or voices that are in that space? If you don't say yes when there is no one else, like the indigenous birth workers, if there's not very many of them, or a lot of us do things in advocacy where in some places, if you say no, there's somebody else who can step in and do it. What if you are in a field where if you say no, that mom won't get a meal that night? Or how do you deal with that, with the guilt portion of it?
Yeah. So a couple thoughts. So you still use the same thing for the guilt, like the same tools, but in this circumstance, you need a much more robust container to build for yourself to hold that guilt. So one, you need your community. So you're with your community here, right, and going to the Silo movie and learning all about it. But I would suggest text thread, email chain, like a regular check-in and source of communication with other folks who are doing similar work and trying to also be a safety net, right? So that it doesn't feel like you're dropping it when you say no, but instead you can reach out to other people and say, hey, does anybody have the bandwidth for this? And if not, you can all have a regular time to check in. So maybe it's like one Thursday a night one Thursday a week, like every month or something, where you talk through some of these different cases, some of these different situations, things that you've noticed. The second piece is agency, in that like feeling like you have taking small actions towards change is a buffer against guilt and powerlessness. So anything that you can do with others, not by yourself, but with others to start to solution or problem solve, like, oh, do we need again, like the text chain, the community, do we need a hotline? Should we apply for a grant? Should we, kind of identifying that it's a problem and then bringing in other people to help move forward, which I know is what pretty much everyone in this room is doing already, but kind of like leaning into it more to remind yourself that yes, you can't be the operator and the nurse on call for every single crisis that happens, but you can be working in a larger capacity to try and build a structure and a container to help prevent some of this in the future. I think it's just sort of that constant ebb and flow of being the safety net and having to understand that it can't always be you. Does that help at all or make sense or not really? What's that? Oh, yeah. Have you heard the glass balls? No. Okay, so Nora Ephron, who was the filmmaker who made, what's it called? You Have Mail and all those great movies. Yeah. So she when she was giving a talk, she talked about how you have to know which balls are rubber and which balls are glass, right? If you're juggling all these balls, if they're glass, they're going to break. The rubber ones will bounce. But every single thing in your life cannot be a glass ball. That it's just impossible, right? That's how you land in the hospital. That's how you land burned out and throwing your hands up and being like, peace out, I can't do this anymore, right? Success is staying in the game. So you have to identify for yourself which things are rubber. And I think that this also requires, like, I'm not a big fan of rules, like giving yourself a rule, like always do this or always do that, because our lives are just so much more complicated than that. And I think we have to take context into play. Like, you know, I have a 2-year-old, so there's certain things that with my 2-year-old, it's like, no, I do really need to be there. And then there's other things where it's like, actually, like, no, if I have a patient that's going through something, I'm going to offer them an evening session, and I'm okay with that. So I think we have to be able to use, again, like with the pause, like you use your judgment. And yeah, there's going to be times, there certainly are times for me where I put my patients ahead of my family when I have a patient that's going through something that is like very, very crisis level. But I don't think that that makes me a bad parent because I'm using my judgment and discerning in deciding which of those situations require me and only me. And that's why I think you can't really like kind of say, you know, no calls after 9 p.m. or whatever it is, because there's always going to be extraneous circumstances. Other questions? I promise I won't bite. Yep. Yeah. I mean, I think it's an epidemic, especially for female healthcare workers and people who are like healthcare adjacent too, because it's how so many women in this service space get their self-esteem too. Like I once had a boss who would tell me that she would brag about keeping her sleeping bag under her desk. And at the time I was in my training and I was like, oh wow, like she's so dedicated. Now I'm like, no, that's terrible. Why would you say that to the people who work with you? Like that is a terrible example. I think that with martyr mode, I think there's two pieces, or a couple things to think about. One, it impacts the people around you. Like, it is not pleasant to be around somebody who is burnt out and constantly saying yes and is secretly / not so secretly, like, super resentful and seething on the inside. Like, nobody likes to be around those people. We all know them. And it's not fun. And so I think when you find yourself in that kind of cycle, because we all go through it, right? You have to be able to name it for yourself and let go of some ego. Like, understand that actually, like, I'm not so selfless. I'm actually doing some of this so that I can get a kudos. And I feel like I need to prove myself to get that kudos. I also think that when we see it coming up in other people, like in our social groups or our friends groups or our text threads, I think that saying something, obviously not like confrontational, but like modeling, you know, hey, I'm gonna, I said no to that thing, I said no to that, I'm not making cookies, I'm not gonna be room mom, whatever it is, like giving your reasoning and saying it out loud helps, because I think in so many of those female spaces, there can be a lot of judgment and a lot of kind of like exalting that superwoman or supermom myth. So when you're able to step up and say like, no, I didn't do it, or I'm not going to, or whatever, that helps be permission for other people. I'm trying to think of, there was something else that I was going to say. Now I can't remember. I think that in the workplace, if you're leading people, if you're leading a team, if you're a director, I think it's something that you have to teach those underneath you. Like you should be modeling it. You should be modeling your own ability to set boundaries, your own ability to take breaks, actually take vacation, all these things. And I think it can be helpful to actually say, especially to the younger folks, like, how's it going? You know, I notice that you have a ton on your plate right now. Like, is it too much? What can we do to strategize to help this feel a little bit more manageable for you? Like, being intentional and showing that you're paying attention to it, even when you're in a system that is overworked and under-resourced and all the things that we know about healthcare and behavioral health. Like, it goes a long way to show that you see it, even though you might not always be able to fix it or change it. Naming it still has value. Does that help at all? Okay.
That, like, by putting yourself as the martyr, like, you're kind of squashing the ability for other people to come up and, like, work beside you or to replace you or be the other person that picks up the ball, right? And so it's like, if I have to attend every delivery, even if it means missing a kids thing or not taking vacation or something, that means that no one knows how to operate without me, which means that I'm always going to have to be there. Whereas if I say, like, there's a system, I would love to be there, but, like, this is the other person, I'm allowing for that space, and so that I'm not so necessary, which feels not good to my ego, but is also protective.
Correct. And it's yes, thank you for bringing that up, because it's another form of gatekeeping, essentially, where you're gatekeeping other people's ability to, whether it's learn skills or participate in care or develop relationships. And for a lot of folks, it is a control thing, too, especially when I see this at home, like, for example, like with a partner and issues around, like, childcare or, you know, how involved the other parent is, where it's kind of like there's a level of anxiety that's underneath and a worry that if you're not the one there doing it and keeping everything in control, then you're going to lose some sense of self. So yeah. Yeah.
I'm just gonna,
Yeah, these
like,
are great
hog
questions.
here. I'm gonna follow you everywhere. So one thing that really resonated to me in the book is, like, about finding, like, your values and, like, but realizing that maybe we're in some cases where we don't remember our preferences. And it reminded me of a time, because I was a single mom for a long time when my kids were really young. And one of the first times that they went with their dad, I was in Missoula, and it was like, Missoula's the city. Like, there's a Target and a Walmart. And I was like, what do I even want to do? Like, I had no idea what I even liked anymore. Like, what do I even want to do with this? Like, I had freedom, and I didn't even know what I liked and how I wanted to spend my time. I think I did go to Target, and I didn't even buy anything. I just walked around because I didn't, I couldn't buy anything for myself, God forbid. Mm-hmm. So can you talk a little bit about that and how the way I kind of feel is that, like, giving that space for us to determine our values helps us claim, like, the tenets build upon one another, and then that kind of gives us our agency. Can you talk about that?
Yes, correct. And I will say that I love deep readers, so thank you. Because not everybody takes it in that deeply, and that's what I'm going for, so I'm glad. you're describing is so normal. It's so normal after an intense period of caregiving, under duress, or not even under duress, but where you have made yourself, you have given everything to everyone else, and then when you finally have the tiny spot of attention for yourself, you're like, whoa, I have no idea what to do. So what I usually recommend is that you just make very small. You do really small things, like really, really tiny things. Like, what am I gonna cook for dinner? I'm gonna cook something like just for myself. I'm gonna let myself go to the grocery store and like wander around and explore and like find something that, you know, kind of, that I fancy, right? Like it's like a very sort of like an indulgent type thing. And it's not like, oh, I'm going out and buying like a Prada bag. It's like, no, I'm gonna make this little dinner for myself, and it's gonna feel good, and it's gonna feel nice. I had a patient who, a long-term therapy patient who, we were working through this when she started to come into this phase. One of the things that she did or happened for her, like again, you want it to just happen organically, is she doesn't even like riding bicycles, but she just somehow like really got into like bicycles, and she did all this research and ordered this like random like mountain bike, and it was like she picked out all the colors, like she designed it, she looked at the, like it was this very like random just little thing, but it made her so happy. It made her so happy. And this didn't mean she was like gonna go off and become a mountain biker, you know, it wasn't anything deep like that. It was just like a very like, just allow yourself. I mean, I kind of call that play, like a form of play. It's inconsequential. You're not making any big commitments or promises. You're just kind of letting yourself go with what feels good and interesting and fun, and letting it just be really small. And then as you start to collect those little small things, then think about them and think about like what felt good about them and why you liked them and what was sort of underneath or what ties them all together. And that's kind of how you get closer to kind of like what path you want to take, or when it comes time to having to make big decisions, then you can lean on that for like as your data, sort of. Does that make sense? Okay. Yeah, and I had experiences like that too. I remember when I first moved to DC after leaving the cult, actually, and wandering around and being like buying Tupperware for myself, like Pyrex. I grew up in an immigrant family. We didn't have Pyrex. We just had like Cool Whip containers. And and I remember just being so excited and so happy to have Pyrex. Like, just, you know, just things like that where you allow yourself to kind of have it, even if it feels like it's frivolous or pointless. Anything else? We have like 7 minutes, so. And if not, that's okay too. Well, it has been such a pleasure to be here with all of you. Thank you again for having me. And unfortunately, we don't actually have books, but if anybody brought their book and would like me to sign it, I'm happy to do that outside too. So thank you all.